Awareness, the final frontier. These are the explorations of Jonathan Robinson and Brian Tom O'Connor. Their continuing mission, to discover fresh new paths to the mystery within, to seek out new joys and new methods of awakening, to boldly go into the heart of expanded consciousness. This is Awareness Explorers.
Well, welcome back, Awareness Explorers. I'm Jonathan Robinson, and I'm very excited today. We have a special guest explorer, somebody you probably know, Rick Archer of Buddha at the Gas Pump. And I'm here with my trusty co-host,
Brian Tom O'Connor.
How you doing this week, Brian?
Excellent, Jonathan. How are you doing? And how are you guys doing? You've had a busy week, having both just come from the Science and Non-Duality Conference.
I think we're both recovering. It's 4 days of endless non-dualities, so I'm now trying to individuate as a person again after listening to so many things about how we're all one. How about you, Rick? How are you doing?
Good. I slept really well last night and had some nice meditations this morning, so I'm feeling it's definitely overwhelming. And I did better than I've done in previous years in terms of being able to sleep there and stuff, but it's still like sensory overload.
Yeah. And just for our listeners, everybody at Science and Non-Duality knows who Rick is. So he always had about 9 people trying to get his attention. I felt sorry for you. I kind of avoided you, like let the guy be for 10 seconds.
Yeah. I'm going to eat my lunch.
We're honored to have you here today. And what got us to want to invite Rick into this conversation is that both Rick and I have been with gurus for decades, and we've interviewed a lot of gurus and teachers, and we thought that would be really helpful to have a conversation about the advantages and disadvantages of having teachers or gurus on the path. And it's a nuanced conversation. A lot of times people just think, teachers are good or teachers are bad, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And we hope to give some distinctions that can be helpful to our listeners as to what to look out for, what are the advantages and disadvantages. But I want to first begin just briefly with Brian, who has not been through quite the same experience we have. He's used various teachers, but I'm wondering, Brian, what's your view of teachers and gurus before I get to Rick and I, who I'm sure will have a lot to say about the subject.
Oh, I'm sure you will. Thanks, Jonathan. It seems to me there's 2 extremes of attitudes about gurus. People tend to think of them as either perfect or charlatans. So people often think that the great gurus of the past, like Ramana Maharshi, were perfect and they had no flaws. Or they expect their gurus and spiritual teachers in the present to have no flaws and be perfect. And then they're either disillusioned when they find they're human, or they completely ignore their flaws and follow them blindly as if they were saints, which is, of course, how cults are born. So I find myself being attracted to people who are basically unpretentious, human, but also kind. I mean, I want them to walk the walk and not just talk the talk, but I also don't want them to be someone on a pedestal. What do you guys think?
Well, first, let me say a little bit more about Rick's background. Feel free to chime in more, but Rick has now interviewed something like 400 teachers and awakening people on Buddha at the Gas Pump, and spent, 25 years in the TM community? Is that right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So this guy knows a bunch about gurus and teachers. And and I'm really curious as to what might be your first thing you would say when people say, do you need a guru? Do you need a teacher? What do you tell them?
Well, firstly, I want to compliment Brian on what he just said. I thought that was very nicely articulated, and I concur with what he said. But I would say that there's no universal one-size-fits-all kind of prescription. Mm-hmm. I think, and people go through different phases in their life. There might be a phase in which a teacher would be really valuable, another phase at which it might not be so valuable. So you kind of have to go by your own lights to some extent. And I think that one sort of common denominator or ground rule we could lay down is that whatever you do, make sure that you are using common sense and discrimination and discernment as best you can, and seek to cultivate those things in yourself. You know, question and think and you know, ask questions. And, you know, you don't have to be a pain in the ass and kind of a perpetual skeptic or something, but you should never just sort of take anything blindly. You should never assume, if you have a bad feeling about a situation or a teacher or something, that they know more than you do, and therefore you should doubt your feelings. Because in my opinion, everyone who is living and breathing on this earth is a work in progress. And that would even include, you know, some of the greatest masters, and, you know, the Buddha or Ramana or whatever. I still think that since we have relative personalities, there's always room for learning and growth. And there's always room for some refinement in our behavior and so on. And so the thing Brian said about perfection, I just don't think you're going to find it in the relative. It's not the way the relative is designed. And so teachers, like all human beings, are going to have certain shortcomings. And if they deny that, and if their students deny that, that's when the trouble starts, you know, because it's amazing how far off the rails some teachers have gotten, and they've just dragged all the other boxcars of their followers with them, you know, off the rails. And, you know, we've seen these documentaries like Wild Wild Country, for instance. These scenes have just gotten so strange, and there was just a lack of discernment and discrimination among the followers. If there hadn't been, the teacher wouldn't have been able to do what happened.
Yeah, you know, you bring up a lot of important points, and I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate, because everything you said made total sense. The problem is that when you get a guru or teacher and he has a lot of students, all those things that you just mentioned tend to fly out the window. You know, the followers of, say, Osho or Andrew Cohen or any of these gurus who have now have a lot of people saying that wasn't a good scene. And I was part of a group for 25 years where if you challenged the guru, not many people, nobody would back me up.
Right.
Actually, the teacher in this case would back me up a little bit, but nobody else would.
What group was that?
I was with a teacher named Justin Gold, and we didn't have a name.
I think I've heard of him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's good the teacher would back you up, and maybe it would have been even better if the teacher had encouraged the others to be more supportive of your kind of attitude. You know, it's like, I like it when teachers say, you know, I mean, even the Yogananda's book, you know, his teacher, Sri Yukteswar, said to him, you know, if I ever seem to be falling from my state in any way, just, you know, call me on it. You know, I can use your feedback and support. So, and there have been some very good teachers whom I respect greatly, who, among the best, who have that kind of attitude, and they make it explicit. Otherwise, this kind of culture gets built up, as you perhaps experienced there, where it's kind of uncool to question the teacher or something, and those who do are kind of seen as troublemakers, and that's really not in everyone's best interest.
Yeah, I've heard Ajasanti say many times, you really have to be the authority.
Yep.
You know, don't believe anything I say. You try it out and you experiment with it, and you have to know it experientially, and it has to be what works for you.
He's actually quoting the Buddha there. The Buddha said that too.
Ah.
He said, don't believe anything anybody says, even if I say it, just because they said it. You have to base it upon your own judgment, your own experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All these things are really wise, but in actuality, they can be hard. And I think, you know, my experience in the group I was in, and maybe your experience in the TM community, it's hard to question the teacher when you don't get that support. What was your experience in that community where
Well, it sort of like many communities, it sort of got progressively more cultish over years. And it finally reached a point at which if someone came to visit Maharishi in Holland and said, brought him any kind of constructive criticism, they would find their bags packed by when they got back to their room, and they were out of there. He just didn't want to hear it. So he became very insular, and he just didn't accept any sort of feedback or criticism. And it enabled him to kind of get more and more off into aggrandizement and la la land. And it's like these communities are kind of like, there's that saying, hitch your wagon to a star. These communities are kind of like the guru is the star and all the followers are the wagon. And they end up kind of, if the star goes like it's a falling star rather than a rising star, that they end up all falling with them.
Yeah.
That's not to say that, this would be important to say here, because I don't want to start dissing the TM movement or Maharishi. I just want to say that like everything, it was kind of a mixed bag. And I've gone through various phases of processing what I went through with that organization, and I went through a rather cynical phase, but I kind of resolved all that. Now just my predominant attitude is gratitude. And, even though I know certain things about his personal life and all, which might be troubling to people who are devotees, when I see a picture of Maharishi or something like that, I just feel this love for the impact he had on my life, which was incredibly profound and continues to this day, that impact. So, and I guess the point I'm highlighting here is that there's no black and white. It's nuanced, like you said in the beginning. And you can, like the band sang in the night they drove Old Dixie Down, you take what you need and you leave the rest.
Yeah. That was a statement that my teacher Justin used to say, take what you can and leave the rest. And in America, we're so individualistic. It's easy to say, groups are bad or gurus are bad. And I also want to present the other side, because sure. I also have an incredible gratitude to my teacher and the group. And I think it's important to present how important they are for spiritual growth. And there's no way I would be where I am today without all that support and all his loving kindness for 25 years. Yeah. And unless you've been through that experience, people say, well, I don't need a teacher. Well, sometimes you do. And sometimes you have to find somebody who can give you something that you can't get just by watching somebody on YouTube or going to a weekend retreat.
I mean, you could buy all the textbooks that you would buy if you went to Princeton and studied physics, and you could sit at home and study those textbooks. But chances are you're not going to get as good a physics education as if you went to Princeton and studied with great physicists.
Yeah.
It's going to be something in that live dynamic that's richer than just doing it on your own.
Yeah. So Brian, what you haven't done the guru trip, but you have made use of teachers, and I'm wondering what your experience is like, a little bit of spending a little bit of time with various teachers over the years.
Well, I did actually study one-on-one with Locke Kelly, and it was almost like going to a therapist every week, only...
He is a therapist.
Yes, he is. Only what we would talk about is awareness and awakening, and we would exchange thoughts and ideas, and he was enormously helpful because I think he's an ethical, kind, I think he walks the walk. And I loved it. And then I would go to meetings and meet other people. And also in a retreat in Sedona with Stuart Schwartz. Stuart is also wonderful. And the people that I met there and the people that I meet in a weekly meetup. I just go to a meetup once a week where we watch Rupert Spira videos. And I've been doing that for years. And the people, the community that revolves around it is, I think, almost as important as the teaching itself, because we share how we react to the teaching. And also in that situation, we're not afraid to say, well, I didn't quite get that answer. I didn't understand that answer, or that didn't speak to me, or this method. We have one woman in the group who really dislikes the movie screen metaphor, but she loves the dream metaphor. And it's so much fun to share that.
How about the ocean and waves? Did you like that one?
Oh, I think that's the best one of all. I think everyone likes that one. But I did have a question. You've spoken to many teachers and spoken to many students and been involved. Do you think this is changing over time? The issue you were talking about people getting involved in a teacher and having them be perfect and following along and rising and falling with their star.
Yeah, I think it is. And before I totally answer that question, I want to just add to something you just said about group community situations. I think that they're useful not only in terms of the human interaction and the ability to bounce ideas and discuss things and so on with each other, but there's something to the notion of collective consciousness. There's a sort of the whole is more than the sum of its parts kind of thing, where you get a group of people. I mean, I used to do group meditations in groups as large as 8,000 people, and it was really something. I mean, just having that many people in one huge room all meditating together, it was really profound. So there's definitely something happens on a more subtle level, aside from vocal communications and stuff, that is valuable about being in a group. I just want to add that. Okay, so the thing about whether things are changing in the whole culture with regard to gurus and so on, I think there have been so many examples of things not going well with various groups that people are wising up and getting more wary and less naive about these things. And in fact, as Jonathan probably knows, at the SAND conference the other day, well, let me preface that by saying a year ago at the SAND conference, I gave a talk on the ethics of enlightenment because of the kinds of issues we've been alluding to here. And I kind of went into quite some detail about the whole history or tradition of ethical values on the spiritual path, and some of the problems when they are ignored and so on and so forth. And after my talk, I sat down with Jack O'Keefe and Craig Holliday and John Prendergast and Kent Walsh and some others, and we had lunch together. We just talked about the whole thing and about perhaps the need for some kind of a organization of spiritual teachers, some kind of organization of professional spiritual teachers that would have some kind of code of ethics that wouldn't be kind of cut in stone by any means, and would be a collaborative, evolving thing, and that wouldn't be an authoritative body that would grant or revoke licenses or any such thing, but that would kind of set a standard that teachers could agree to, and that their students could be more confident in them if they had agreed to. And so we formed that over the past year. It's set up now as a 501c3. And we're starting to take members. We presented it at the SAND conference. And the response to our presentation at the conference was really heartening. I mean, one teacher came up to, was a pretty well-known teacher, and she just said, thank you. She said, this is so much needed. Oh my God, I'm so glad you're doing this. And a lot of people were saying, yeah, right on, about time. So I think people have just gotten fed up with all these horror stories of, some of them really egregious, some of them kind of mild, but people are kind of come around to the feeling that we need to get our act together as a larger spiritual community in this respect, and just learn as other, helping professions have learned, such as psychiatrists and doctors and others, that there are certain lines that you do not cross. There are certain standards that you uphold if you are going to present yourself in this way, and that your job is really to help people, not to find people to sleep with or money to take from them or any of these other, things that have rocked and disillusioned spiritual communities.
Yeah. And I thank you for being a major force in that endeavor, because it has been so needed. And one of the unintended consequences of all the teacher guru scandals is people have started to form communities that are not hierarchical. And I think that that's a new development that has been really important. I know I'm part of a couple of communities now that there is no teacher, and I remember something the Dalai Lama said, which was that the next Dalai Lama might not be a person. It might be
next, not the next Dalai Lama. Actually, this is Thich Nhat Hanh. He said the next the next Buddha may be the Sangha.
Right, right.
There you go.
Taking the emphasis off of one person and putting it on the Sangha, the community.
Yeah.
And I think that that's starting to happen, which is, I think, great news. But, teachers are also going to play a role for some people at some times. And I'm wondering, what if a person is looking for a teacher or a guru, what might be things that they would look for that would say that's a good fit, or that's a person that I can trust?
Okay. Well, firstly, there's a different strokes for different folks kind of issue here, where certain people are going to resonate with other teachers, with different teachers, and it's kind of cool in a way that there's this sort of it's like what I do with my show, what you do with yours. Not that long ago, we would have had to own a television station or a radio station or something in order to do this. And even then, we wouldn't have been able, we would have had to own a network to get it out to the world. Now, I used to say in my hippie days, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one, man. But now it's like we can all be publishers, and we can all have a worldwide audience, and if we generate something useful, then people will tune in. And so the sort of teacher dynamic has kind of followed the technology in the same way, whereas it used to be that with Jesus or Buddha or something, they could only cover, a territory that they could walk around in their sandals in a lifetime. And now it's like, instantaneous all over the globe, communicate. And personally, I think this is exciting, and I think it actually has kind of deep significance in terms of saving the world from disaster. I think that the upsurge of spiritual awakening is like the Earth's immune system kicking in, to prevent it from climate change, disaster, and so on. But so choosing a teacher. So now you have a lot to choose from. I've interviewed over 400 people. You've interviewed a bunch of people, and I have hundreds of people who would still like to be interviewed. So there's a smorgasbord of teachers that you can choose from. I suppose, first of all, you need to consider what lights your fire, who speaks to you, who resonates with you. And then you might want to have certain kind of standards that you would expect in a teacher in terms. And we try to vet guests carefully and not have people on who we feel we would be uncomfortable referring people to, because it is sort of a referral. When you interview somebody, they get a lot of attention. And I've had to take down some interviews when I've discovered things that made me uncomfortable continuing to refer people to those teachers. So I think if people take to heart the kinds of things we're discussing here and the kinds of things that we were discussing at the SAND conference, this whole ethics situation, and realize that that's an important dimension in choosing a teacher. And that if you're really ardently sincere about higher consciousness or awakening or enlightenment, then be serious about it. You don't need a cult. You don't need a daddy or mommy figure. You need someone who can help you actually genuinely experience what they ideally are experiencing, which is another thing. That are they walking their talk? Are they talking about one thing and then acting in a way that suggests they aren't actually experiencing it? There has to be some genuineness. You should feel some confidence that this guy really knows what he's talking about and just hasn't just read a bunch of books and learned how to parrot some words.
Yeah. In my experience with my teacher, I got to live with him in the same house for 18 years.
Right.
It's hard to hide who you are when you're living with somebody. And that was really advantageous. I got to see that he was walking his talk. Most people don't get that, but, Google can help. You can type in, teacher Beyond Ananda or whatever it is and see what scandals show up. If there's a bunch of them, maybe that's not the right person for you.
We actually do that sometimes when doing guests, checking out guests. We say, Joe Schmo controversy or Joe Schmo scandal, and we just see if anything comes up,
Yeah. Brian, what's your hit on this?
I once did that. When I was searching for Adyashanti, I wasn't searching for it, but I typed in the word Adyashanti, and the phrase Adyashanti scandal came up. And There was nothing. I
Yeah,
mean, I don't know why it came up, but there were
probably
no
other people
scandals.
had been searching to see if there was any problem.
Ah,
You know?
well,
Yeah.
I didn't find any, I'm happy to say.
He's about as clean as they come.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's
yeah.
fantastic. And I also want to applaud the efforts that you were just describing a little while ago, because I think ethics among spiritual teachers is really important, and creating an organization for that, especially, as you put it, a non-hierarchical organization,
Yeah.
I think is a really, really great idea. And as a matter of fact, it occurred to me that you might have something like, you know, how therapists have supervisors or people in a 12-step meeting have mentors. What do they call them? I forget.
Sponsors.
Sponsors. That teachers might want to like team up with someone like that who can you know, be honest with them, and they can sort of keep them from getting.
Yeah, that's a very interesting issue, and one we're sort of thinking about and trying to deal with in our Association of Professional Spiritual Teachers, which I believe is professionalspiritualteachers.org or some such thing. And it's like, because instances have come up. In fact, an instance came up not that long ago where a pretty good friend of mine, well, really good friend, I began getting all this feedback about him that there's problems, you know, and here and there and everywhere, different problems. I ended up talking to half a dozen people that had been interacting with him more closely than I, and they all gave me an earful. And then I said, well, let's have a conference call with this guy, like a Zoom thing, like we're doing now, and air our grievances. And I checked with him. He said, yeah, I'd like that. He said, I really obviously realize it's a problem, and I really want to get your feedback and try to improve myself, try to take it to heart. But then I had a real hard time getting any of these complainants to sit down and do that. They feel like it's going to be a tar baby situation where the more they get involved with them, the more they're going to get stuck. But I kind of came up with the metaphor that, you know how mountain climbers rope themselves together for safety, so if one of them slips, the other can catch the guys to fall. And it's actually a bit of a risk to all the climbers because he could pull them down. But it's this sort of mutual trust and agreement thing where we're all in this together. And I kind of think we could think of ourselves in the larger spiritual community in that way. We're all climbing this mountain together. I don't know if anyone has reached the summit or if there even is a summit. And if people are willing to participate in with the right spirit, then it would be nice to think of ourselves as roped together. And if somebody slips a bit, to help that person regain his footing. Now, if somebody is just continually goofing around and, you know, and expecting to be dragged up the mountain, and you may need to cut the rope, you know, let him fall if that's what he seems intent on doing. But as long as the person is contrite and serious and honest and introspective and seems to want to improve, I would hope that a spirit of mutual support will evolve more than it has so far in the spiritual community. It wouldn't necessarily be the entire community getting involved, but little clusters who have some kind of connection or affinity with the person would reach out and try to help them get back on track.
Yeah, that's what people should be doing for each other in the spiritual community. And I like that sentiment. You know, I always like to ask people, one of the things we try and do in Awareness Explorers is get the methods that help people integrate awareness and spirituality into their daily life. And you've been around the block. This isn't your first rodeo, Rick.
Yeah.
I'm curious as
You asked Francis Lucille about that yesterday.
I did. Yeah. So that's the question I always like to ask, because I think, it really comes down to nowadays, we all know a certain amount of theory. We know stuff that we might not have known 30 years ago. There's a lot of agreement about some spiritual theory and what we're here to do, but there's not that much talk about let's do it while walking to the car, having a conversation on your computer, where we spend 98% of our life. So I'm wondering what you currently find really useful for you in integrating this into your life.
Sure. Well, my path has been meditation, as you know, and I've been meditating for over 50 years now, on an average of 2 or 3 hours a day. And Maharishi always used to use the analogy of dyeing a cloth. He'd say you You dip the cloth, the way they used to do it in ancient India, dip the cloth in the colored dye, bleach it in the sun, loses most of its color. Dip it in the dye again, bleach it in the sun, loses most of its color, but a little bit more remains. And you keep doing that until it's color fast and it won't bleach anymore. And so meditation, you dive into the transcendent, sort of immerse yourself in that for a while, and then you engage in activity. And whatever that may be, your job, your family, things you need to do. And by the end of the day, you kind of feel like the meditation's worn off, but there's something has stuck. There's been some neurophysiological change. There's been some stabilization of what was experienced in the morning. And then you do it again, and then you wear it off, and then you do it again, and then you wear it off, and you just keep doing that. And, over the years, it just gets more and more full in the midst of any activity, no matter how challenging or dynamic. There's something that's rock solid that can't be bleached, can't be lost. So that's been my path. Other people, I couldn't really say. I don't think, obviously there's some things you can do during the day in terms of just, Don Juan Matus in the Carlos Castaneda books said a warrior has time only for his impeccability. I think there's something to be said for being on your toes, not being sloppy in your behavior or your speech or anything like that. You can't just think that I meditated, now I can do whatever the hell I please all day. There should be a seriousness and a precision as best as one can do it in terms of how one behaves, because otherwise you just kind of create new karma for yourself, So that's how it's kind of worked for me. But obviously, if other people have very different types of practices and paths, it might be different for them. But I can only speak from my own experience.
Mm-hmm. I love that metaphor, the dyeing the cloth and doing that. Since I don't have 2 or 3 hours a day to meditate, mine is partly that. I meditate for about an hour a day. And then I try to do.
Well, I started out with much less, but then I kind of, I'm kind of an extremist, so I got.
Well, if it's fun for you and you
it is,
really
it's
enjoy
totally
it,
enjoyable.
That
never been a chore.
Yeah, that sounds great. Do it.
Yeah.
What were you saying, Jonathan?
Well, I'm just saying that the combination of the meditation plus trying to do very simple practices during the day that, like we talk about here, and you can read about. I find that combination has been useful, that they kind of support each other, that the meditation helps me to do these quick practices. The quick practices help me to have a better meditation experience. But that took me a long time to integrate those two things, because daily life is like an onslaught now. It never ends, and it's going by pretty quick.
I agree, Jonathan. I think the combination of meditation and what Locke Kelly calls it glimpse practices. I call it games, awareness games, that you can throughout the day actually, in a moment, go back to or turn your attention around to the background and then turn it around again and look at what's happening from there. And when you do that often enough during the day, it can really sort of keep your meditation going all day.
Yeah, I would take exception to that slightly. Maybe that's useful, and maybe it's useful more in the beginning, but a time will come when you don't really have to do that any more than you have to remember to breathe, or any more than you stay clean throughout the day by remembering the shower you took in the morning. The thing becomes so ingrained in your neurophysiology and your consciousness that nothing can shake it loose. And obviously pure consciousness is not a thought, so you don't gain it by thinking about it. It's that which is beyond thought, or at the foundation of thought. But anyway, I don't mean to diss if anything you may have found useful. I'm just thinking, I doubt that Ramana, for instance, had to check in and remind himself of who he was, or or anything like that. He couldn't have forgotten it if he wanted to.
That's true. That's true. And especially when you're there, having realized what he realized. Yeah. But to
maybe
get started,
it's a huge,
I think
it helps to establish it.
And it's sort of like Nisargadatta, his teacher told him, just constantly look at the I am.
Right.
And he did that many, many times throughout the day. But then you're right. Eventually, it's like many, many drops of oil in a pan. They eventually touch each other and become one large, continuous drop.
The only cautionary note I would say is don't do things which divide your mind. If, when Gurdjieff was originally teaching and Ouspensky, they advocated this sort of self-remembrance thing. And people would, speak and then pause, and then speak and then pause. And and it was like they kind of, I got this from Maharishi because he encountered a lot of them when he first came to the UK in the early 60s. And at some point he said, "What is with you people? Why aren't you speaking fluently?" And they said, "Well, we're trying to remember the self." And he said, "Oh, no. He said, this, you don't remember the self by thinking about it or any such thing. You just need to sort of, dive in and have that experience fully, and then engage in dynamic activity, and self-awareness will become integrated in the midst of dynamic activity, and it won't impair activity. It should actually enhance it. Yoga is skill in action, the Gita says. It shouldn't diminish your skill."
That's a really good caveat. You just be it. You can't not be it.
Exactly.
What makes this very interesting and nuanced is that depending upon where you are on the spiritual scale, different things are needed.
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying that, because I've been thinking that in the back of my mind as we've been saying this. Yeah.
And so part of our job as spiritual seekers or finders is to say, this is where I'm at. This speaks to me right now. And maybe in a year it'll be different.
Yeah.
And that's true whether it be in consciousness or your development of other areas of your body, your body, your emotions, your mind.
When you're learning to ride a bicycle, training wheels can be real handy at a certain point, but after a while they're an impediment.
That's a really good metaphor. Exactly. and having friends or a community or a teacher who can kind of help you see those things can be a real blessing on the path. If that community or teacher is really there to give you useful reflections versus just get something from you. And I think we're getting
what you're saying now kind of brings us around to your original point, right? That there might be a stage at which a close relationship with a teacher, even one that appears to be somewhat dependent or something, could be really valuable for a person. And then, a decade later, it might be totally inappropriate. So it's different things are valuable at different times.
I was lucky in that my teacher actually suggested that I leave. Yeah. He said, I think you got what you're going to get, and it's now time for you to enter the world. And that's, partly a sign of a good teacher that says, okay, congratulations. Now go forth and see what happens. And so hopefully this discussion gives people some new distinctions and nuances and ideas as to what's involved. It's not simple, as Brian said. It's not teachers good, teachers bad. It's a very complicated subject, and having some of these distinctions might help save people a bunch of time where they may have gotten into groupthink that wasn't good for them. Any final words you want?
Well, just on that point, we seem to have a tendency as human beings to want to fall back into black and white thinking instead of nuanced thinking. Republicans good, Democrats bad, or vice versa. Guns good, guns bad. Abortion good, abortion bad. And there's sort of like this polarization that's plaguing our society these days. And I think that it's nice to culture a more nuanced perspective about all things, including the political things I just mentioned, and to sort of realize that there are shades of gray and there are exceptions to every generality. And it's don't sort of set, it's kind of a laziness almost to polarize yourself rather than trying to see things.
Find the truth.
Find the truth, which actually is very nuanced and very all embracing. The totality embraces all of these crazy things in the universe and the world.
Yeah. Well said. Any final words you want to throw in, Brian?
Well, thank you very much, Rick. This has been really informative, entertaining, and I loved your metaphors. I think they're great. And I loved the last metaphor about the training wheels. And just real briefly, when we were kids, my little brother rode a bike with training wheels, and he rode it really rough, and he rode it all the time. And those training wheels actually got bent out of shape so that they were no longer touching the road anymore. And he didn't realize it. He didn't know. He didn't know he was riding the bike without the training wheels until someone noticed and said, "Hey, you can take these off now and you can ride."
That's great.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
So the tagline we always end with people is the words "keep exploring," but not just keep exploring for you, keep exploring for the whole spiritual community out there, and become part of a community. Tell people about this community and Rick's Bat Gap community. You can find his 400 some odd interviews at batgap.com, BATGAP.com. And that's quite an incredible resource for all spiritual seekers in the world. And I know a lot of people, including me, are really grateful that you've gone into such depth. And together we're going to hopefully learn more and more about the nuances of teachers and methods and trying to hold each other accountable to a higher standard. And that's what we really all need in this day and age.
Yeah,
so
the thing that we're involved in is a lifelong endeavor. Don't sort of don't think that you're going to just get it wrapped up in 5 years and just kind of go on and do something else. I mean, this whole spiritual evolution business is a long game, and it's a fun game. It's not like you should be in a hurry for it to be over. It's a never-ending adventure and discovery and so on. So, to me, it's the most exciting and wonderful thing. I'm really glad to be participating in it.
Yeah, well said. And Brian, your final words before we sign off?
Yep, it's an adventure. I love it.
Yeah.
So keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite podcast app. And we'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.